Now on BBC One in Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, 30 years since the Bradford City Stadium tragedy, BBC News correspondent Robert Hall returns to Valley Parade.
Yesterday, Bradford fell silent. The city remembered 56 supporters who didn't come home after a fire at a football match between Bradford City and Lincoln City 30 years ago. Last month, football paid its own tribute. Why do you think it should be remembered?
It just has to be, doesn't it? Because of all those poor people.
My grandma definitely helped me out and put me into the stand, and she just told me to run.
These days, Valley Parade's high cantilevered stands tower proudly above the city's skyline. On match days, it's just like any other football ground. But on the 11th of May 1985, 56 souls were lost when fire swept through the old main grandstand. 30 years on, many of the supporters at today's game against Fleetwood are too young to remember the tragedy. But for the thousands who watched in horror and disbelief, that afternoon is as real as if it was yesterday. In the past month, theories have emerged that the fire may have been caused deliberately. But now we can reveal for the first time the name of the man who told detectives he had accidentally started the fire.
Before we chance to even introduce ourselves, he simply says, "I've been waiting for you."
One thing is certain. The roots of this tragedy lay in the neglect that ran through the veins of British football in the 1980s. Of the 56 people who died on that Saturday afternoon, 54 were Bradford City fans and 2 were visitors. Their names are carved on this memorial, erected on the site of the old stand. Their ages range from 86 to 11. They all died because they couldn't escape a fire which had begun beneath their feet and which became an inferno within 4 minutes. Lincoln City were the opposition that day. Bradford had already been confirmed as champions of the old 3rd Division. Before the game, Peter Jackson lifted the league trophy.
It was a really joyous occasion because we've won the championship with a really young team and a team that give everything. And a team that were really close. For me, particularly as a Bradford lad, to go and pick a trophy up the championship, it was an immense feeling really going down Valley Parade that day.
Carl Hepton was 9 years old. That season, he'd started going to games with his grandmother, Nellie.
That day, my grandma was trying to get tickets for all the family to go. My mum, my dad, my brother, you know, my cousins, and obviously it was such a big game, everyone had bought the tickets early.
Less than 2 years earlier, Bradford City had been rescued from receivership by 2 local businessmen, Stafford Higginbottom and Jack Tordolf.
I saw this, just a very small pall of smoke going from underneath the stand. And I thought, oh, what's somebody done wrong now?
Glyn Leasing was a constable with West Yorkshire Police. He was one of the first to notice that a fire had broken out.
I climbed over to the seating area to try and see if I could investigate a little further where the smoke was coming from. The crowd didn't move at all. They remained seated, engrossed in the football match, almost oblivious of what was happening.
My colleague at the time, John Helm, was commentating on the game for YTV from his position on top of the Midland Road stand.
And we've actually got a fire in the stand on the far side of the ground. And that looks very nasty indeed. Now the police have gone over there to try and quell the fire.
Bradford City had a throw-in, and Stuart McCall, one of their most famous ever players, was, I believe, taking that throw-in, and behind him I just noticed a very small glow.
Now these are extraordinary scenes at Valley Parade. It's supposed to be a day of celebration. One hopes the stand doesn't burn down.
Bradford City's player coach Terry Yorath had been trying to concentrate on the game, but he was distracted when a policeman walked in front of his dugout.
And something in me made me follow him, you know, like just watch him walk back up. And as he walked back up, people started to jump over the wall.
Now a BBC weather forecaster, in 1985 Paul Hudson was 14 years old. He was a regular at Valley Parade.
On that afternoon, just before half-time, I was stood with my uncle and we just noticed, just down here, wisps of smoke coming up from the stand, but there was no sense of panic. Nobody really knew what was going on. In fact, people made a joke of it at the time.
And the police are doing a tremendous job in getting people out of the stand and onto the pitch.
I had to continue commentating, obviously, on what I was seeing, and without trying to be over-dramatic. I wasn't aware of the gravity of the situation. I couldn't possibly have been. Very rapidly, the flames were engulfing the stand and people were scrambling out.
First you could see a bit of smoke, and then you started to see flames, and then obviously where the fire were coming up through the stand, you could see them people who were sat in them seats had, you know, moved away.
Already there was thick, black, acrid smoke beginning to gather at the top, and you began to see the flames coming up.
Tony Delahunty, who was commentating for Pennine Radio that day, described the panic that was starting to build.
People are spilling onto the pitch and we can see the flames going up into the air there, and people are running around, they're running around beside us, they're running around all around us, and people are saying, get onto that pitch.
There were quite a few people beginning to climb over what was a wooden barrier into the back of the stand, because I think people's natural reaction was to get out towards the back of the stand.
I can remember looking up and all black smoke were like curling over the top of my head. I could see it, just like a wall, all behind me with thick black smoke, and I just remember it moving. I was just looking up. Obviously I was small, so the only thing I could do was look up, so people were bigger than me, and I could just remember black smoke curling over the top of my head.
It was only a very, very narrow space, and on the left-hand side I approached a kiosk where you could get tea and coffee and things like that, and I remember the details like it was yesterday. There was an old gentleman stood there and he'd just bought a cup of tea, and he refused to move until he got his change.
I think gone back to the boardroom, they're still drinking. And I said to them, do you realise there's a fire? You've got to get out. The door on the far side just blew open. And all of a sudden now they realise what's going on.
The heat is now becoming tremendous. I'm sitting immediately opposite the main stand.
And I just remember that thick black smoke. It was black as night. The wall of smoke just crept down, and then eventually it was just like the middle of night. You couldn't see anything at all. And then I can only describe it as everybody's animal instinct kicked in. I think perhaps that's what happens, but... So it's just
30 years ago, it's still difficult.
Yeah.
Have you thought about it much since then?
Well, you do on occasions. The detail is just very graphic.
Carl and his grandmother found refuge from the smoke in a small storeroom at the top of the stand, but respite was only temporary because they were now trapped.
Me and my grandma just looked at each other, and this bloke smashed the window. I can't remember if he helped me out and my grandma, or it was just my grandma. My grandma definitely helped me out and put me into the stand. And she just told me to run. And that what last seen of her. So I know, when I think about it now, that she wouldn't have left.
Nellie Foster never got out. She was 64 years old. The main stand here at Valley Parade is built onto the slope of a hillside. It's completely covered in concrete now, but back in 1985, the floor of the then wooden stand was about 2 foot above the ground, and in that void, rubbish had been piling up for years. Now, the club had been warned that it was a danger, but they hadn't got round to clearing it, and on the day of the fire, it just took one spark. Bradford businessmen Stafford Higginbottom and Jack Tordoff had taken over Bradford City in 1983. When you drew up your list of priorities, what were they?
The necessary thing was, in the main stand that got destroyed by the fire, we had got a quote from a contractor and all the materials from him, and we're going to put a new roof on the main stand because that used to, it was like a sieve, it rained everywhere.
In 1981, the Health and Safety Executive had written to the previous board asking about evacuation procedures for the main stand. And a year after Tordoff and Higginbottom took over, the Fire Brigade wrote 2 letters to the club.
The timber construction is a fire hazard, and in particular, there is a build-up of combustible materials in the voids beneath the seats. A carelessly discarded cigarette could give rise to a fire risk.
Nobody from the authorities ever followed up those warning letters to check that the club had made the stand safe. What about the letters, the warning letters? Do you, on balance...
Well, no, we didn't... the warning letters came previous to that on the previous board of directors, and we weren't aware of the warning letters. And they weren't followed up by the council. But there was a letter turned up afterwards, warning about litter under the stand. But I personally had no idea the council had been inspected it.
Was it a shortcut? Was somebody just being lazy? Or was somebody trying to pinch a penny?
Last month, one survivor, Martin Fletcher, published this book about the blaze. Mr. Fletcher lost his grandfather, uncle, father and brother in the fire. The book claims that the Bradford City chairman, Stafford Higginbottom, had a series of fires in his past. It's true that there were 8 blazes at business premises either owned by or with connections to Mr. Higginbottom between 1967 and 1981. The most famous of these fires destroyed the Tebro Toys factory in December 1977. Mr. Fletcher claims Mr. Higginbottom received huge insurance payouts after the 8 fires. Mr. Fletcher doesn't make any direct allegations in this book, but he does say that the earlier fires ought to have been more fully investigated at the time. Multiple fires, he suggests, are rarely just a coincidence. Stafford Higginbottom was never charged with any offence connected to those fires.
You're a likeable rogue, Stafford, and if there's a fire, they used to attach Stafford's name to it. Stafford must have walked past it, but only jokingly. But I couldn't imagine Stafford lighting a fire. He certainly wouldn't have lit a fire at Bradford City.
Raymond Faulkner was a senior detective inspector with the newly formed West Yorkshire Major Crime Unit. He says Higginbottom's history was well known.
We knew that Stafford Higginbottom had had, shall we say, some spells of bad luck with some of his businesses, in particular Tebro Toys. And all the fires that at his premises, any premises he'd been associated with, were investigated.
It's Martin Fletcher's view that the investigation, which was established within hours, failed to look hard enough at Stafford Higginbottom's history.
Did the officers who tried to extinguish the fire give you any idea of how it started?
They said that people near them had said that the flames seemed to be coming through the floorboards, through the floor. I have a team of detectives who are making inquiries into the cause of the fire, and there are forensic scientists working on it as well at present.
Those forensic scientists, with help from detectives, initially worked on a theory that a smoke bomb thrown into the stand had ignited the fire. But only one witness claimed to have seen that happen. They had to begin looking for an alternative explanation. Investigators were able to tell the exact spot where the fire had started because, by pure chance, an off-duty police officer was sitting in the stand enjoying the game. And he had a camera with him.
These photographs helped us to pinpoint exactly where the fire had started.
Investigators held a reconstruction in Bradford police station to help witnesses recall the events. Everyone who'd been seated in G Block were asked to attend. After excluding those who were injured and those who had died, the occupants of just 2 seats remained unaccounted for.
So we asked the people who were sat next to these 2 empty seats, and one recollection was that the 2 gentlemen were an old man and his son, middle-aged son, and the old man had emigrated a long time ago from Bradford.
The missing men were actually an uncle and nephew. They were visiting from Australia, and the hunt was now on to find them. After exhaustive house-to-house inquiries, Raymond Faulkner knocked on a door in South Bradford.
It was answered by a gentleman who invited us in, and before we'd chance to even introduce ourselves, he simply says, "I've been waiting for you."
That man was Eric Bennett. Years before, Mr. Bennett had emigrated to South Australia, but he was back in Bradford that summer to visit friends and family, and he went to the match that afternoon.
He then took us into the sitting room of his house and said that he'd been at the match, he'd been sat in the stand, right where we knew the seat of the fire had taken place. He said he smoked a cigarette, dropped the cigarette onto the floor in front of him, went to put his foot on it, but it unfortunately dropped through, he said, a knothole.
Mr. Bennett said he tried to put the fire out by pouring his coffee on it, but within minutes smoke had returned, this time accompanied by flames.
So they rushed to the back of the stand, got hold of some policemen, told them what was happening. The policemen very quickly started to evacuate the stand. We know the tragic results of what happened. The truth is that he dropped a cigarette, and he was quite unequivocal about it. He dropped the cigarette that started the fire.
What was his demeanour when he told you that?
He was obviously troubled, and I felt extremely sorry for him. And this will be weighing on his mind for the rest of his life.
30 years on, it'll probably never be possible to be 100% certain who or what started the fire. What we can say is that among the investigators at the time who we've spoken to, there is complete confidence that the fire began accidentally.
As the police force, we sort of made the decision that we weren't going to release his name to the press or to anybody else. But of course the final decision is with the coroner.
Eric Bennett has since died, but his relatives have confirmed to us many of the details of that day. However, they say Eric never told them that he had dropped the cigarette which started the fire, though they did remember him saying that he tried to put it out with coffee.
Valley Parade has become a blazing inferno.
The TV cameras that were at Valley Parade to record a football match ended up providing experts with key evidence of what had happened. And even today, those images are regularly used by fire safety experts in training courses.
Guidance at the time was that if you had a combustible stand, there was a need to evacuate people in 2.5 minutes. Some exits were boarded up. Some were not available because they were locked. Some were bolted rather than padlocked, but they weren't readily available. And really, in that sense, there was a sort of disaster waiting to happen because it was never going to be possible to clear the stand in 2.5 minutes.
You might imagine it would be reasonably simple for spectators to escape via the pitch. But now the poor design of the stand at Valley Parade enters the equation. As the main stand was built into a hillside, all the official exits were at the top of the stand, at the back, exactly where the smoke and heat were most lethal. And because the club wanted to keep standing and seated spectators apart, getting to pitch side was complicated. Unless you were close to either end of the stand, the only way down involved a 5-foot jump to a small terraced area in front of the seats. Even now there was a further obstacle. The advertising wall was lower on one side than the other, so once you were over, there was a 5-foot drop to get to pitch level.
That final moment, you're trying to get over this barrier, and everybody's kicking and screaming and pulling at each other, and pushing and shoving, and I still to this day don't know how I got over.
It really was pandemonium at that wall, but the heat, to me, would be undescribable. The coat I was wearing, like others, melted. It was absolutely unbearable.
The closed exit gates and the failure to clear litter from beneath the seats came to be seen as symbolic of the mismanagement of football. Are you surprised, in retrospect, that there were no prosecutions?
I think what you have to remember is that we were living in a different age. There was less of a blame culture when there were deficiencies in fire precautions. I think what one could say with confidence is that in this day and age, there is no doubt that there would be a prosecution.
It was many hours before the authorities could confirm the final death toll. The vast majority of fans had scrambled to safety onto the pitch, although many suffered horrific burns. But once the fire was extinguished, a grisly scene was discovered at the rear of the stand. Most of the 56 fatalities were found close to the turnstile block and by a locked exit gate. 2 days after the fire, the Home Secretary, Leon Britton, announced that there would be a public inquiry led by a High Court judge. On the 23rd of May, less than a fortnight after the fire, Mr. Justice Popplewell walked into this, Bradford's council chamber, to begin his inquiry. He'd already visited the ground and he would later visit the hospitals because many of the most seriously injured and the bereaved were unable to attend.
Oh, it was terrible. I'd seen the film on the Saturday night. We flew up, I think, either on the Monday or Tuesday, and there was the ground as it had finished on the Saturday night, burnt out. It was horrendous.
Because the forensic evidence was uncontested, Popplewell wanted to make progress on his inquiry as quickly as possible.
We were anxious to have it as soon as possible for two reasons. One, while people still had good memory. Secondly, we didn't want to find another fire happening in similar circumstances before our recommendations had been dealt with.
From the start, Mr. Justice Popplewell had made it clear that he wasn't out to apportion blame. His interim report contained two central safety recommendations, though. Firstly, that all large sports grounds should undergo fire inspections with new stands built of non-combustible materials. Secondly, that where there were still old wooden stands, a complete smoking ban should be imposed. Popplewell's final brief didn't just concern Bradford. On the same day as the fire, one young supporter had died after Leeds fans rioted at Birmingham City. And 18 days later, 39 supporters were killed at the Heysel Stadium in Brussels. But while spectator safety was high on the political agenda, the club still didn't see it that way.
We wrote to all the clubs and we got about 10 responses, actual helpful responses. We got about 20 acknowledgements, and well over 50% of the clubs simply never replied. It was astonishing that they took so little interest in crowd safety. It says it all, doesn't it?
We didn't feel responsible for it at all, because we'd only just taken the club over. You know, the plan was to rebuild the stadium, which I did. After the fire, I got the job of rebuilding the stadium. So, and we did, and we got a nice stadium together then, which was perfect. And it should have been like that before. But nobody ever spent any money in it.
It was no different to other football grounds. It's not to condone it at all, but it's just how it happened. I mean, we're talking 30 years ago now.
The fire meant all wooden sports stands in the UK were temporarily shut whilst emergency safety checks were done. Many of them never reopened. Scunthorpe Stadium was demolished soon afterwards because it was less expensive to replace it than to repair it.
The coroner's court is not a place for apportioning blame.
After Popplewell delivered his report, inquests were held. The coroner, James Turnbull, advised the inquest jury to find that the deaths were by misadventure rather than manslaughter. Later, the courts found the club and the fire authority jointly responsible for the tragedy. In total, more than £20 million in compensation was paid to 110 bereaved or injured people and 44 police officers. At the time, it was the largest civil action ever brought in Britain. Separately, a public appeal fund was set up which raised over £3 million. City played at various temporary venues until December 1986, whilst Valley Parade was rebuilt. It was paid for largely with public money. West Yorkshire Metropolitan County Council gave the club £1.4 million, even while it was jointly being sued for negligence. And with further grants from the Football Trust and the club's insurer, Bradford actually received £200,000 more than it needed. Did the club come out of the tragedy stronger?
Yes, it did.
But what about its spirit? Did that change?
No. No. The spirit was always there.
In 1983, Higginbottom and Tordoff paid £30,000 each to buy Bradford City. In January 1988, Jack Tordoff gave £400,000 for Stafford Higginbottom's stake, and Tordoff then sold all his shares in the club for £700,000 in 1990. In the decade since I was last here, so much has changed. To be honest, it's almost impossible to imagine Valley Parade as it was back in 1985. Some people have said that the fire is the tragedy which football forgot. I don't think that's true, particularly here in Bradford. It is true that the club and the city picked themselves up and moved forward with a quiet dignity. But the events which unfolded just a few yards from where I'm sitting still reach forward from history. In the light of revelations in Martin Fletcher's book that Stafford Higginbottom was connected with several previous fires, there have been calls for a fresh investigation. But the man who presided over the original inquiry remains confident that arson was not the cause of the blaze at Valley Parade.
I can understand, the grief. I mean, that's perfectly genuine, and good. He's done a remarkable work of research, and all hail to him. But I think the conclusion that this was arson is mistaken. There's absolutely no need for another inquiry. I mean, I think the police ought to have a look at, and get the fire authorities to have a look at these previous incidents, and a report, but I suspect that they'll find nothing of any value.
We invited Martin Fletcher to take part in this programme, but he wasn't available.
The particularly valuable lesson of Bradford is that it was all there on film. Young fire engineers today can actually see this fire almost from the point of ignition.
We'd resolved this terrible tragedy. We'd found the man that dropped the cig that started the fire.
It don't make me angry, really. It makes me sad, doesn't it? I've lost my grandma. It don't make me angry.
People knew it wasn't a malicious act. People knew it wasn't a homicidal act. People knew it was an accident.
My daughter said to me, "Did you get counselling for the fire?" And I said, "No." Big butch footballers, didn't happen to us, getting counselling. But I left the next year.
Why do you think it should be remembered?
It just has to be, doesn't it? Because of all those poor people. And I still can't believe it's 30 years ago. I can still smell the smoke. It was just awful.
Think about it nearly every day. I still, something like that you can never, it'll always be with me, won't it?